Most of us use our right hands for throwing, or jump higher using our right foot for takeoff. We are all more skillful with the limbs on one side of the body rather than on the other. This lack of symmetry in the body reflects a lack of symmetry in the structure of the brain. Each half or hemisphere of the brain controls the limbs on the opposite side of the body, but each half also tends to specialize in different ways of thinking and perceiving. The human brain is the result of an unbroken chain of evolution from the earliest forms of life. The nerve impulses by which primitive organisms react are identical to those in the human brain. The only difference is that the nerve cells have increased in number and in complexity of organization to become eventually man's specializing hemispheres. Only 1/10 of the human cortex is used in controlling movement. 9/10 is focused inward, toward the world of thoughts and emotions. A world that spreads far beyond the instinctive behavior of the animal kingdom.
In more ancient animals, the two sides of the brain are probably more or less doing the same thing. Now that would really entail some duplication of function. One of the reasons why that probably occurred in the lower animals is partly that each side of the brain was paying attention to the opposite side of space, but there was probably another reason in that there was possibly some advantage to the animals so that if one side were injured, the other side could still carry on the function. In the course of evolution, it became clear that having this margin of safety wasn't as valuable as being smarter. And so it became obvious that the brain simply needed more processing capacity. And the simplest way to increase the processing capacity of the brain would be to have each side become specialized.
The brain's two hemispheres possess a range of mental skills that allows man to explore the heights and depths of his physical universe. Above all, in the midst of the crowded world that surrounds it, the human brain has the unique ability to look inward, to know its individuality, to be conscious of itself.
Back in the middle of the 19th century, when it seemed that the problem of the origin of man in evolution seemed to be solved with the announcement both of Darwin and Wallace and the theory of natural selection, and we started studying the evolution of man and so on, the big problem that was left over was this problem of the origin of consciousness, the origin of all this space that we have up here, seem to have up behind our eyes. How could that have evolved out of mere matter?
Somewhere in the upward thrust of evolution, the brain has become conscious of itself. But the question remains, how can this unimpressive-looking 1,400 grams of material, with its wrinkled, putty-like skin or cortex, built in two halves, joined at the base by a bundle of connecting nerve fibers, how indeed can this be the center of our consciousness?
This is the problem that both Darwin and many other people tried to face and tried to solve in various kinds of ways, all of them being quite unsatisfactory. I think they were unsatisfactory because they didn't stop to analyze exactly what consciousness was. And when we do analyze what consciousness is, we then see that it is based on language, is based on metaphor.
Visual metaphors and patterns of sound that the brain translates into meaning. Language is the brain's ultimate achievement. Language is the route by which thoughts are made conscious, and it exists within us only as a network of nerve impulses.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
In almost all of us, language is processed in the left hemisphere.
This is okay. Show me how you can wiggle your fingers. Keep on wiggling.
In this test, in which the patient feels little discomfort,
Can you count
Jun Wada of the
4,
University of
10,
British Columbia first injects a dye opaque to X-rays into the artery supplying blood to the left hemisphere. This shows the route an anesthetic will follow when it is injected during the test. A similar series of X-rays, seen from above, shows how the dye, and hence the anesthetic, will flow only into the left hemisphere. It is vital the surgeon confirm where speech is located in each patient, so that an intended operation to alleviate epilepsy can be safely performed. The test also shows that the left hemisphere controls the right hand.
Start wiggling. Now I'd like you to count slow and loud to 10 and back to 1.
1,
Okay? Don't stop counting.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
The left hand remains upright, controlled by the still conscious right hemisphere.
Carry on.
now. Okay. Carry on counting for us.
Speech gradually returns as the anesthetic clears the left hemisphere.
1,
Okay, you did very well.
What we are trying to do here is to find out which side of the brain, which side these patients have speech function. And these knowledges are very important for us when we are contemplating of operating these patients.
Although 95% of the population has speech in the left hemisphere, there are exceptions. And for this reason, it is necessary to map the geography of each patient's brain to avoid interfering during surgery with such vital functions as speech and short-term memory. In a second test, a week later, the right hemisphere is anesthetized.
Matthew, could you start wiggling your fingers? Keep on wiggling, eh? And look straight ahead. You don't have to look at me. Look straight ahead. Okay? Now start counting loud and slow.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 10, 9, 8,
The conscious left hemisphere has retained speech.
5, 4,
Great.
3,
Okay, could you show the object?
Okay. Tell me what that is.
fast forward.
Right side, make a fist.
But the anesthetic in the right hemisphere causes disoriented movements of the opposing hand.
None at all? Show me how you can wiggle your fingers. What number did we show you?
8, 3, and 1.
8, 3, and 1. That's
Very good.
terrific. You remember well, don't you?
We better take off your rings. Could I have those? Thank you. Now, I'd like for you to rotate around on the table and put your legs up here. Okay? Now I want you to lay back into this helmet very carefully. All right, I got your head now. Okay, slide back in there. Okay, push back a little bit. Okay, that's looking good.
This research technique, used to study normal subjects, measures the blood flow pattern and therefore activity in different parts of the brain.
Now what we're going to do is I'm going to let you breathe a little radioactive tracer called Xenon-133. As you breathe it for about 1 minute, it's going to saturate your brain and the rest of your body. And then with this scintillation detector here, we'll measure the uptake and clearance of the tracer from your brain. And the way this scintillation detector works is it has a little focusing element at the front. Then it has a crystal in the center, and when a gamma ray, which will be coming out of your brain, hits it, it causes a spark of light. And the rest of this apparatus is just to count the number of sparks of light that it sees in a period of time.
First, the blood flow pattern is stabilized as the subject relaxes and listens to neutral sound from the tape recorder.
Now we'll inhale the gas.
The test will show that when neutral noise from the tape recorder is replaced by spoken words, there will be an increase in activity in a particular part of the brain. The change in activity will become evident on the oscilloscope readout, showing the left and right hemispheres, in which each square represents a gamma ray detector.
Playground, airplane, football, inside.
As the
Cowboy.
brain processes the pattern of sound waves into meaningful words, the two squares along the bottom of the left hemisphere are gradually
Cowboy.
filled with light.
Baseball, hot dog.
The very act of
Playground.
thinking about words results in increased activity in that part of the brain.
All right, lay back. Just, oh, slip your head a little forward. All right, now slide back.
In a different way, a subject with a severe stutter illustrates how the brain processes speech in this test devised by Frank Wood.
But their joy and victory was diminished, for they returned without the silmarils from Morgoth's crown.
The amount of blood
And they
flow,
knew that
as
they-
indicated by gamma ray emission, is high in both right and left hemispheres as the subject tries to deal with her stuttering.
To see, and thence in many a fleet the elder set sail into the west and came. And
But
they
treatment
became
with
forever in
tranquilizers
the
for a week
him that
reduces
never
stuttering to a
reigned.
minimum.
And they entered into the realm of shadows. Those who used the 9 rings became mighty in their day, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. They obtained glory and great wealth, yet it turned to their undoing. And one by one, sooner or later,
The oscilloscope compares the previous pattern of high activity in both hemispheres with the state after treatment. The right hemisphere has become relaxed in a more normal pattern, and activity becomes concentrated in the left hemisphere.
They could walk if they would, unseen by all eyes in this world beneath the sun, and they could see things in worlds invisible to mortal men. But too often they beheld only the phantoms and illusions of Sauron, and under the domination...
There are 2 deep clefts known as the Sylvian fissures in the left and right hemispheres. But the fissure on the right, in the majority of the population, is less developed than on the left. It is along this massive fissure on the left that the comprehension and processing of speech is normally carried out. There is a structure in the speech processing area that can be seen, even with the naked eye, to be larger on the left of the adult brain. What is more surprising is that fetal brains, the brains of the stillborn, also show on post-mortem examination a more highly developed speech area on one side. In 9 out of 10 cases, this is in the left hemisphere. But the pattern ranges all the way to cases that are symmetrical. Female brains tend more to this symmetrical pattern than the brains of male children, although there is a wide range in both sexes. And there are a few, those of the true left-handers, in whom the speech areas are a complete mirror image of the normal. Even at birth, there is a special area of the brain ready to accept the stimulation of speech sounds, and which is particularly adapted to building the necessary nerve circuits on which language will be founded. In contrast, the brain of a rhesus monkey shows no similar development. Another view of the brain's uneven shape is obtained through this CT scanner, which displays X-rays as though the head had been sliced horizontally at different levels. The white outline is the bone of the skull. The brain inside seems to push out the skull at the front on the right, and particularly on the left at the back. The bulge on the left is caused by the expansion of the speech processing area. As this distortion of the skull is evident in man, but not in the lower animals, Ralph Holloway of Columbia University began making brain endocasts from the skulls of the higher apes and of early man to see if he could trace changes of shape as the brain evolved, and from this detect a progression toward language.
What we have here are a series of endocasts that go from roughly a modern-day chimpanzee to modern-day Homo sapiens, with sort of the fossil grades in between them. These are Australopithecines from South Africa, and they date probably to about 2.5, possibly to 3 million years. This happens to be a robust Australopithecine, which goes back to about 2 million years, 1.5 million. These are possibly Homo erectuses from Kenya, East Africa, which have a date around 2 million to 1.5 million years. This is a Homo erectus from Java, which is about 800,000. This happens to be the La Chapelle Neanderthal from France, probably dated at about 40 to 45,000 years ago. And like I said, this is modern Homo sapiens. If you look at them, you can see clearly that there is a large difference in size between something like that and modern Homo. The question is, are there also shape differences in these? You can say that this surface is very flat in this region here, which we think has to do with the receptive speech area, and yet it's very, very rounded and protuberant in the modern Homo case. You can say that qualitatively, but to demonstrate it quantitatively and prove it is the object of this exercise.
The brain endocast to be examined is clamped in position, and a series of measurements taken over the whole surface. These are recorded so that a three-dimensional plot is obtained, which can be dealt with mathematically. And the result shows clearly that there is not only the obvious growth in size as the brain evolves, but that an exaggerated bulge had already begun to show itself in the speech processing area in man's earliest ancestors.
And it leads one to speculate that perhaps they did have some kind of rudimentary, primitive sort of speech. Fully elaborated in our own sense, undoubtedly not. But a beginning, yes.
The connection between skull shape and speech development seemed to be contradicted by findings of Marjorie LeMay at the Peabody Museum in Boston.
Since early man had asymmetries, it seemed logical to look to see if some of the primates, the subhuman primates, did. And surprisingly, they also show some asymmetries. And the chimps skull who used to be in Ringling Brothers Circus. And you can see that the brow on the right is much more prominent, and the occipital area on the left is more prominent in this chimp. Even in a baby chimp, one sees the same thing, with a prominence on the right side and in the left posterior. It's not surprising we see it in a baby chimp because we see it also in fetal brains. This is another chimp that shows the prominence of the right and the left occipital area. One also can see this in a gorilla skull. This is a gorilla skull that shows the same thing.
Although the apes show asymmetry, we know that they do not have language. So it seemed at first sight that speech development could not be connected with the left-right skull difference. But the apes are the first among the higher animals to show skilled hand movements in the use of primitive tools. It has recently been shown in a test devised by Doreen Kimura that coordination of fine hand movements in human patients is affected by damage to the left hemisphere, and it is damage to the left hemisphere that also affects speech.
Side of the salad, like that. I'll show you. And we found that indeed patients with left hemisphere damage are impaired in learning that kind of task, and that patients with speech disorders tend to be more impaired or much more impaired than patients without speech disorders. So these two things do seem to be very closely related.
This patient has suffered a left hemisphere stroke, which has affected her speech as well as hand coordination.
Okay, try it again. No, remember, that's right.
It seems logical, therefore, that man's early ancestors, along with the chimpanzee, first evolved a special area of the brain to control these fine hand movements, and that speech was a later and more extensive development of this same area. This seems particularly likely, as the hand is also used in primitive forms of communication. The growth of the frontal lobes seems to be related to problem solving, the ability to think ahead, already evident in primate behavior. Although we can detect the first glimmerings in the higher apes of communication and perhaps consciousness, the actual way in which true language developed is still a mystery.
We have absolutely no evidence of language in the past. The archaeological past is silent, absolutely silent. All we have are the products that man makes, and from those we try to infer possible use of language. And we have the evolution of the brain and the brain structures, and from those we try to infer a use of language. So you have this question. You have tools which suggest an increasing complexity, and you have the evolving brain which suggests an increasing complexity of function. Now the question is, what was going on in that brain and with those tools? And that is the prime question. What was going on inside?
Through some of the Stone Age cultures that still exist, we can look back toward our evolutionary past and speculate further about the origins of language.
The hominid tools are either of bone or of stone, and if they're of stone, then you have to know where the stone comes from. You have to go and get the stone. You have to know the qualities of the stone and the source of the stone. You then have to bring it back and make it for a particular purpose. And every human tool is the solution to a problem. In other words, you don't make a tool until you have a problem. What language is talking about is a more complex visual world. Everything that happens in your terrain is in the visual world. Everything that happens, you then mark by language. So therefore, as your world becomes more complex, as your visual world becomes more complex, you need some kind of marking and linguistic system to indicate what part of the world you're talking about at what time. It's just a development of the increasing complexity of the visual world, which at the same time is increasing complexity in language and increasing complexity in the use of artificial symbols, of colors, of all kinds of other visual markers. But the visual markers are part of the linguistic development. It's all part of one package. Language simply marks something far more complex that you already know. It's sort of cues along the road to understanding. And therefore, nothing that is ever said contains all the information. So that what you really have evolving is not language, but the human capacity, which is a complex. And it's that complex that the brain sits on. Not just language, not just tool use, but all of these things go together. Language is part of tool use. You use the tool in a problem. You use language in a problem. So that really what you have is a complex which was evolving concurrently and simultaneously in every area of the brain. And that is the hominid evolution.
In the past 10 to 20 years, there's been a lot of doing, and there is no longer an acceptance of the belief that the right hemisphere is simply silent. Rather, the right hemisphere seems to have its own special functions, its own special genius. Essentially, the ability to find your way around the world, to be oriented, to know which side is which, to recognize your surroundings, getting your way about. The right hemisphere seems to be very, very important for this. The ability to recognize faces is also a capacity which, for reasons that nobody really understands, seems to be fairly strongly localized in the right hemisphere of the brain.
To recognize one face from another depends on perceiving shape and form, a visual skill totally different from understanding of language.
There are other candidates for right hemisphere functions about which there is somewhat more controversy. Some authorities feel that musical capacities tend to migrate to the right hemisphere of the brain. Other people, and I am among them, think that the right hemisphere of the brain is very important for emotional appropriateness, for sensing how one should behave in a situation, for figuring out what somebody else is going through and how one ought to relate to him or to her.
A sad or a smiling face. To most people, the face on top is smiling, although the two are mirror images. Our right hemispheres, and therefore what we see in our left visual field, dominates our judgment of mood. The visual, as opposed to the verbal skills of each half-brain, are determined in this test developed by Doreen Kimura of the University of Western Ontario.
Ready? Well, the reason you use the tachistoscopic technique, it's simply, what it does simply is to present a stimulus very briefly. And the reason you do that is that if you just present a stimulus ordinarily, in the left or the right field, the subject would immediately look at it, okay? So in order to restrict the input to one field or the other field, you have him fixate some central point, and then as he's doing that, you flash something on so fast that by the time he moves his eyes, it's gone. And that's basically what the tachistoscope does. So that enables you to restrict the input to one hemisphere or the other. If you present it in the right field, it's stimulating initially the left hemisphere. Presented in the left field, it stimulates the right hemisphere, so that the input is only to one hemisphere. Ready? Look at the X.
Yes. 3.
Ready?
3.
Ready?
6.
Ready?
6.
On this simple equipment, it is possible to carry out a great number of tests on normal subjects. The results show that the right hemisphere is more aware of the number of dots in a pattern, particularly when they appear for so short a time that they are just on the edge of perception.
5.
Ready? Look at the X again.
5.
Ready? Look at the X.
3.
Now I'm going to show you some letters. And again, each time I say ready, I'd like you to look at the X. And when the letters flash on, just tell me what letters you saw. Call out the names of the letters.
But the left hemisphere is better at deciphering letters, which requires language skills.
Ready?
HRDX.
Ready?
FW something D.
Ready?
PXMU.
Ready?
SWXB.
Ready?
DWEV.
We have known, of course, from studies on patients with brain damage that damage to the right hemisphere results in very complex disorders such as not being able to find your way, not being able to draw accurately, not being able to construct things perhaps spatially and visually.
The German artist Raderscheidt suffered a right hemisphere stroke, which destroyed his ability to draw. Distortion in the left visual field persisted until he finally recovered. And the artist Corinth, who drew these portraits, showed the same left hemisphere distortion after right brain damage.
Some people have also suggested that artistic capacities are housed primarily in the right hemisphere. It's almost a who's who of the great artists. People like Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael were left-handed. And this suggests to me that many of the things which were most important to them, which were central to their lives, which they lived for, were things for which words were not the optimal means of expression, the optimal means of communication. And it was probably easier for them, as people who were dominant in their right hemisphere, at least for drawing and quite possibly for language too, to focus on those activities which we think of as being, quote, right-brained activities.
These horses of Leonardo's can, without unfair comparison, be placed alongside these, drawn by a retarded 6-year-old girl. The balance between our purely visual, as opposed to language skills, or what appear to be the competing skills of the right and left hemispheres, is underlined by the extraordinary case of the left-handed Nadia.
Nadia arrived in my clinic without any kind of warning as to how she was going to upset all our ideas about children's drawings. I had been phoned by her mother, who had simply told me that she had this little girl of 6.5 she was very worried about, who had practically no speech, who was attending a school for severely subnormal children, was not making any progress, and somebody had suggested she should get in touch with me. And her mother said that she had brought a few drawings with her, and would I like to see them? And she brought them out, and in the twilight of the observation room, I looked at them. I think I was absolutely dumbfounded. I didn't know what to make of them, because they were so sophisticated. They were so impossible for any child of 6.5 to have produced, let alone a severely subnormal child, which was what she was supposed to be. She drew with her left hand, and she only drew with ballpoint pen. And what would happen when she started to draw was she would take the ballpoint in her left hand and she would smile. And suddenly she would come alive. She would become a different child. And her whole body had more movement in it. Her face had more movement in it. She'd get a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. And she would start to draw, and then she would draw very quickly, very deftly. If she stopped for a moment and thought and looked at the picture and then came back, she would come back to the same line where she had stopped and continue that line very flowingly, something that you or I would probably find very difficult to do. And she produced pictures which were of the most incredible power. And to have a child like this, rather lumpy little uncoordinated girl producing pictures of this kind was just quite incredible. And I still can hardly believe that it happened.
But as Nadia grew older and began to talk, her drawings began to change.
Her ability became more economical. That is to say, the pictures she produced, like this one up here, began to be more spare in the way she drew them. They were not so detailed. I think this picture is like a Chinese horse in its economy. I think a beautiful picture. She started that way, and then gradually her ability fell off and she became less subtle rather than more economical. But along with that, and I think perhaps part of the reason for it, she simply was less interested in drawing at all. She was more interested in people. She was more interested in the things that she now was able to say to people.
It is a safe thing to say that in our culture, Western culture today, there's a great emphasis on language proficiency and in those capacities which build on language, literacy, reading, writing. And in many ways, our civilization is due in a significant measure to the important role played by literacy and language. This probably has had its costs. It's tended to overemphasize those activities in that part of the brain which is involved in language, and by necessity, therefore, underemphasize some of those capacities which are represented in the non-dominant or the right hemisphere of the brain.
For generations, the Eskimos have lived in their Arctic homeland, where it has been their visual as much as their language skills that have been essential for survival. Perhaps the fact that so many amongst them are great artists is a result of this particular heredity. In order to find their way in the featureless wastes of the north, they must have been acutely aware of the faintest visual cues in the landscape. This environment has probably developed in them extraordinary right hemisphere skills, because over the generations, only those could have survived who were sensitive to the shapes and contours of their inhospitable land. This seems a likely explanation for the imagination that so many of them show in the shapes and forms they now carve in stone. Science has been able to uncover a few of the mysteries locked in the brain's two hemispheres, but it still faces the awesome task of determining how the hemispheres combine to form a unique and single personality. The hemispheres communicate through a bundle of nerve fibers at their base. These connecting fibers have been cut in the patient Paul. This operation has been successful in preventing the spread of epileptic seizures across the hemispheres. Ironically, we can gain from this so-called split brain patient an extraordinary insight into how the two halves might work together.
What was the question?
This one particular patient that we are studying is unique of all split brain patients because both hemispheres in this young man have language, but only one has the ability to speak. So what you have is a left hemisphere that understands language and can talk to you about its feelings, and you have the right half brain who understands language but cannot talk. Yet it has a very special executive ability. It can spell using printed letters and arranged letters to answer questions. So for years now, people have been wondering in these split brain patients whether they really are doubly conscious, and here we can quit wondering and ask this right hemisphere what it thinks, what it feels. And you do this very simply using flashing procedures. You can flash questions exclusively to one half brain. And what we do is ask his right half brain a set of specific questions.
Okay, Paul, here's a who question. Who blank? What's the dot? Who? What's the dot? Who? What was the question?
The left, or speaking half, didn't get the question.
What was the word that was flashed?
Wait a minute.
Try spelling. What's the dot?
But the silent half can spell that its name is Paul.
I'll give you a simple command now. You just carry it out. Okay, what's the dot?
Paul's speaking mind does not see the word hit and is unaware of what he is about to do.
What did it say?
Punch.
One sees how this very important and unique thing in man, the verbal system, is continually busy trying to interpret our actual behaviors, our actual overt and covert behaviors. And it has daily, minute by minute, to deal with why we're doing what we're doing and constructing a theory.
In this test, separate pictures are flashed to each hemisphere. The left or speaking half sees the envelope, but is unconscious of the furnace flashed to the right or silent half. Paul is asked to make a story from what he has seen by selecting cards. His silent half brain picks the shovel to match the furnace, and his other speaking half picks the mailman.
A mail. What's he carrying in the bag? The shovel must go with, the ground where it needs it right now to shovel the snow.
Paul's speaking mind tries to fit the shovel into the story of the mailman, unaware that his silent hemisphere has seen the furnace.
What Paul teaches is that a lot of our impulses to do things are not known to the verbal system prior to their action. They are non-verbally encoded. They're in us. They're very deeply in us. They come out. And once the behavior actually comes out, then the verbal system has to deal with it and give it an interpretation. And we submit that that is a major mechanism of consciousness, and it's one of the things that's continually going on in you and me as we go through life.
Unlike the outward prompting we have given Paul's silent hemisphere, images seem to flow from some deep inner source in the creative mind of a Toller Cranston.
Well, every time that I do close my eyes, I do in fact have a rush of images and fantasies that go by so quickly that when I'm painting, I want to reach out and grab one and stop one, and that's really what my paintings are. But there's so many that I've missed that it seems unfair. So I'm just bombarded with such a profusion of fantasies. It's like turning the light on instead of turning the light off.
The illuminated surface and the hidden worlds that inspire it. Even in the logical moves of a game of chess, the computer, which can complete 1 million calculations in a second, still cannot match the human player. The human brain has encoded within it, generally in the right hemisphere, a range of spatial perceptions beyond the ability of the machine.
Well, the main difference is that human chess player tends to play on the basis of pattern recognition. We seem to have the ability to look at the board, to decide what is important. We can make a judgment about the given position at a glance. Now, computers have no such ability at all. In effect, they have no pattern recognition ability which could be employed in a situation like this. If one could equate pattern recognition or the ability to recognize patterns with perhaps intuition, then one could state quite categorically that while humans rely upon intuition a lot, computers have zero ability to do so. And the complexity of the game, when they attempt to break it down into this immense sea of possible combinations, is just too time-consuming a task to do effectively. Even if we assume that computers performs over 1 million operations per second, it would still take a tremendous number of years to play even a semi-reasonable game of chess.
For Beethoven, who became deaf, music existed only in the hidden circuits of his brain. Perhaps we will never know how a new thought is generated and surfaces to the conscious and verbal mind. How, in fact, the combined hemispheres think. The thought, once born, can be frozen in language. The place of the sun can be changed by a Galileo, or a Newton can shift our view of the universe. With Descartes, we think about thought itself. With Darwin, we are made aware of our origins, and with Jung, we look at the unconscious mind. The brain from which these concepts come to light has been 700 million years in the making, starting from the time when the first primitive forms of life inhabited the earth. Deeply coded within it are the vestiges of its long journey, the instincts of the animal, the skills of the hunter. The growing awareness of the social being, knowing its tribe, imagining the shapes and voices of its gods and demons. And now these timeless visions are illuminated by language, as the mind tries to impose reason, a conscious and logical structure, onto the thoughts and experiences that crowd from within. But to allow room for language, this newcomer in our mental hierarchy, the brain's hemispheres must divide their labors. It is somehow in this final evolutionary step, in which language is integrated with other forms of perception and with deeper levels of consciousness, that mere matter becomes transformed into that baffling and mysterious entity, the mind of man.